Good morning. I'm Gerard Lyons. I'm a senior fellow here at Policy Exchange, and it gives me great pleasure on behalf of Policy Exchange to welcome you to this latest in the series of Policy Exchange events that are mirroring and accompanying the various virtual party conferences. Naturally, we're here at the Conservative Virtual Conference. Welcome to people who are watching us live and to obviously those who are watching us on playback. So the proceedings are going out live but can be watched again later. It gives me a great pleasure to welcome three great panelists today to discuss Is Thatcherism Over? The panelists are Stephen Bush, political editor of The New Statesman. He writes not only a weekly piece, but he has a must-read daily email that you can request from him. He will then be followed by Vicky Pryce, one of the UK's leading economists, chief economic advisor at the CEBR, and previously co-head of the Government Economic Service. And after Vicky has spoken, she will then be followed by the Right Honourable Jessie Norman MP, a Member of Parliament for Hereford and South Herefordshire, but also very importantly, Financial Secretary to Her Majesty's Treasury, and not only a notable parliamentarian, but an excellent author as well. So after I make some introductory comments, Stephen will then follow me, then Vicky, and then Jessie. The aim is to finish within the hour, hopefully by 5 to 10 in real time. And before we finish, each of the speakers will give some final wrapping up comments. So is Thatcherism over? I don't think it's possible to give a definitive yes or no to that question. I think it's a very nuanced answer. But if I was to have asked this question at the Labour Party or at the Liberal conferences, I'm pretty sure that the members would have said that they hoped Thatcherism was over, but they didn't think it was. Here at the Conservative conference, the spirit of Thatcherism lives on, but one of the reasons for actually having this debate is because it's not quite clear what the answer might be to the question amongst the Conservative Party faithful. One might actually ask, what would the Prime Minister think? Well, back in 2013, when he was during his second term as Mayor of London, Boris Johnson gave the annual Margaret Thatcher lecture. It was to a packed audience at Gibson's Hall in the city. It was one of his most impressive speeches, but judging from how the press reacted to it, it was seen as a controversial speech. And the reason for that was that time, Boris Johnson aligned himself, I would say, pretty fully with Thatcherism. Indeed, he said that the government of the day, David Cameron, himself, and Mrs. Thatcher would probably have similar answers to the key questions of the day. We can naturally discuss that during the panel discussion and the debate. But also, it was quite clear that Boris Johnson then, and I would guess now, would say that Thatcherism is living on. Let me quote one thing from that speech he gave in 2013. Admittedly, 1 week is a long time in politics, so 7 years is an eternity for some people. But to quote Boris Johnson then, by the time she was eventually felled by her own MPs, I'll miss out what he actually said about those MPs. By the time she was eventually felled by her own MPs, her achievements were not limited, they were colossal, and they were, in many respects, irreversible. In that speech, and maybe today, we can discuss some issues linked to what Margaret Thatcher might do if she were in power now in terms of addressing some of the key issues of the day, because that's very much linked to the question. At that time, Boris Johnson clearly thought that when it was in terms of social mobility, Margaret Thatcher would be fully engaged in addressing fully social mobility. Not everyone, it has to be said, across the country might necessarily agree. And the levelling up agenda is core to this government's economic policy. There are clearly many other issues that we might discuss today on the economy, on Europe. Would she, for instance, be enthusiastic about state aid? But also, to conclude my comments, it's important to say that in the early years of Mrs. Thatcher's time as Prime Minister, she was being questioned fully about her leadership. Indeed, in March 1982, at that time, she was the most unpopular Prime Minister since records began. We then had the Falklands War. She responded fully to the crisis, and within a few months, she became the most popular Prime Minister of all time at that time in terms of records. and she subsequently went on to win clear majorities at the subsequent elections. So in terms of electoral success, she can't be doubted. Whether her legacy lives on in other ways is the topic of our discussion today. So thank you for joining us. I will now ask Stephen Bush, the political editor of The New Statesman, to come to the podium. Thank you. Stephen.
Thank you very much for having me this morning, and thank you very much for that introduction, for kicking us off. It's strange doing this in a way, not in Conservative Party conference, not least because that's what we're all used to this time of year, but because if we were, we would be surrounded almost by the religious symbols of Thatcherism. There would be mugs of her with her famous posters for sale. There would be tea towels with "Labour isn't working" in that queue. In many ways, Conservative Party conference would feel a bit like the Anglican Church, where the symbols of the faith are visibly present, but are the articles of faith as present? Now, in a way, right, the answer is, of course, Thatcherism isn't over. It is present in every person who has stock options, in every council home that is now in the private rented sector or owned by an owner-occupier. But I think in a very real sense, its sort of health and presence, at least within the Conservative Party, is at least more contested than it's ever been before. David Cameron's great success, whether you enjoyed it or did not, I think was in rebadging and remodelling Thatcherism in a way that allowed it to win again after the success of Tony Blair, by bringing in a kind of social liberal message, and also by managing to make inroads into groups who were demographic benefactors of Thatcherism, the affluent ethnic minority middle class, the social liberal rich, and bringing them back into the Conservative tent. Now we have the first significant Conservative majority since Margaret Thatcher, but built on this promise of levelling up. I mean, bluntly, we have to be realistic here, right? This is a country shaped by successive Conservative governments, shaped particularly by, in our modern form, by the revolutionary Conservative government from 1979 to 1990. So if we are serious about levelling up, and people are talking about places in the UK which have been left behind, I mean, left behind by who? They weren't left behind by Tony Blair. Look, I mean, I'm sorry, they just weren't, right? Like the problems of Darlington, of Mansfield, right? They did not begin in 1997. They simply didn't, right? And either you take the view that actually the global picture in which the bottom billion have been, you know, wealth has been vastly redistributed to the poorest in the world, and in which the losers have broadly been concentrated in the upper working and lower middle class in advanced economies. You can take the view that that is good and right, but it's very difficult to take the view that it is not primarily a consequence of the revolution that Margaret Thatcher built. But of course, because we have a situation where we have the first Conservative government committed to levelling up, in some ways to undoing some of those changes, Thatcherism is more contested than it has been before. I think the last sort of thought I want to leave you with, to give the other panellists time to speak, is whether or not that needs to be the case. Because the thing that many of these seats have in common, right, is actually, you know, take Darlington or Wolverhampton North East. These aren't seats that have been Labour held for decades. These are seats that were last held by the Conservatives in 1992. So I would urge everyone in the I'd urge everyone in the Conservative Party, indeed in the Labour Party, to think very carefully about whether or not there's been some slight myth-making about these seats. There's some slight myth-making about why they voted Conservative. Because I think one of the interesting positions that the Conservative Party finds itself in is it is still very fond of the symbols of Thatcherism. It's rejected many of the tenets of Thatcherism, but it hasn't yet found any tenets for anything else. And the big challenge, well, I would say the big challenge at this conference, the big challenge usually at this conference would be for people to find something else, because if it's not over, it's certainly not as healthy as it was even 2 years ago.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Stephen. Vicky, if you could come to the podium and make your comments now. Thank you.
Well, I'm not going to come to the podium. I'm going to talk from my study, so I hope that's okay. So I'm going to look at it from a slightly different angle. There are quite a lot of policies that are associated, of course, with Thatcherism. And one of the major ones is the belief in monetary policy, certainly in the early years of Thatcher era. And remember what it was all about. The belief was at the time that the aim of the government was to achieve low inflation, sustainable growth. And that had to be achieved mainly by controlling monetary policy. And that had been very much the sort of mantra that was used for a while. It actually also implied that in order to get that policy to work, government needed to not intervene in any other way, let the markets work and use perhaps micro policy up to a point in ensuring that growth and investment sort of happened. And that would happen mostly by having the right environment, particularly a low tax environment, to encourage businesses to take advantage of this and then grow. It did suggest very little state intervention. And that is where I think the change has happened. Yes, we can talk about what happened with the unions. We can talk about what happened in terms of opening up the economy to foreign companies coming and acquiring quite a lot of British companies. We can talk about the abandonment in some ways of manufacturing as a sort of major part of the economy and focusing a lot on services, which has left us in a bit of trouble right now. But I think a lot of what was the sort of core of Thatcher policy seems to have been turned on its head, and that is, of course, mostly because of the crisis. So we're talking about where we are now. It doesn't mean that quite a lot of what she believed in terms of managing the budget and being very careful about, not overspending and controlling that in any way you can has now been abandoned for the time being, at any rate. And that is, of course, because we're now talking very significant, in terms of very significant involvement in the economy. We're talking about the government even taking shares in firms through Project Birch that they're developing. We're talking about a huge expansion in spending to control the economy. And what therefore seems to have happened is that the emphasis now is on government being directly involved in growth and employment. We've been hearing what the Chancellor has been saying, and being a lot less worried about monetary policy. Money supply has been allowed to expand quite significantly if it wants to, and encouraged, of course, through all sorts of influx of liquidity in the market by the Bank of England, and of course the government itself, through its guarantees, has encouraged firms to borrow very significantly as well through all the schemes that exist right now. In addition, of course, with Stephen Bush's comment about what's happened to the areas in the north and elsewhere which have suffered from manufacturing decline, there is now the intention to improve pay, encourage more development in terms of encouraging businesses to come into those areas and spur again some sort of industrial growth, and a huge commitment to state aid so that we can help companies to survive in the future and ensure that we have this levelling up that Stephen talked about as well. So I would say that this is a crisis which has actually thrown out Thatcherism in a very, very big way. The question, of course, is for how long? We've heard the Chancellor say that it was a sort of sacred duty of the government to balance the books again, with all sorts of promises of doing that in the future. But in his today interview this morning on the BBC, he was saying, yes, of course, but the question is one of timing. And you can talk the Thatcherism mantra, if you like, and say it quite well to the faithful. But I think we now probably have, it's certainly a Chancellor who's very practical in terms of what is required in the economy. So I'm suspecting that these tax increases that everyone is worried about will not come for some time. And in the meantime, the state intervention in the economy is still going to be very significant. And I will stop here.
Vicky, thank you. So, Jessie, there you are. Stephen thinks that the tenets of Thatcherism have almost been discarded by the Conservative Party. Vicky thinks that the crisis has temporarily at least thrown out Thatcherism. I detected she might wish it was thrown out permanently as well. Over to you, Jessie. You don't
Well, thank you very much indeed, Gerard, and thanks to Stephen and Vicky for their comments. I must say it's been a very interesting session. I've greatly enjoyed it, and I thank Policy Exchange. I mean, look, my view is extremely simple, which is that we need to make a few early distinctions before we can really start to answer the question. The first is, as it were, to distinguish between crisis management and what you then might call the business of government. And Mrs. Thatcher, I think, you read Charles Moore's biography, she certainly, I think, felt she was in crisis management for at least the first 4 or 5 years of her time in office. And it probably wasn't until after the 1983 election that she started to feel, well, we're really starting to get on top of the situation. We can start to make what you might call positive governmental change, as opposed to just rescuing a situation which she thought was at serious risk and in many ways dangerously so. So that's the first point. I mean, what was that situation before? That's the second question. And of course, it's almost inconceivable, particularly for a younger audience now, to remember, and I don't want to overstate it, but I mean, I was alive at the time, and Vicky and even you possibly, Gerard, and I vividly recall what it was like living in the 70s, and I don't think there's much doubt that we had a world in which the unions had so much power that they felt able to negotiate and parley over labour market policy directly with the Prime Minister. Beer and sandwiches at number 10. Jack Jones, who ran the TUC, the General Workers' Union, was a major figure in British politics. We had very high marginal rates of taxation. You couldn't take more than 50 quid out of the country. You had to wait several years for a mortgage, in order to persuade your building society that you were eligible to be lent to. There was a kind of hidden stagnation in the economy. And of course, there were specific industries that were operating in a global context in which they were grossly uncompetitive. And of course, to go alongside that, there was a significant failure of public services, which was heavily dramatized for people by the 3-day week. So when Mrs. Thatcher came in, she came into a situation in which it looked as though the private sector wasn't delivering and the public sector wasn't delivering, and the situation was critical. So that was, I think, the initial motive energy which caused the Conservative Party to bring her to the leadership and then her to act so decisively. And of course, we can look back and say there were things in retrospect that we think she might have got wrong, or as it were, over-egged in one direction or under in another. But the broad architecture of what she did is surely not really much contested even now. So I don't think anyone really thinks it was a bad idea to open up the country to foreign investment. Yes, we've seen great national treasures, notably in the chocolate industry, getting bought up by other companies and other countries. But we've also seen astonishing investment, notably in the auto industry. Nissan in Sunderland being the flagship example. People forget that Nissan makes more cars at full production, has made more cars for many years than Italy. That's a non-trivial fact. Of course, we also saw Vodafone. Can anyone saw privatization? Can anyone really think that it would have been a sensible idea to maintain the state monopoly of telecommunications when we've seen what happened to cellular telephony, Vodafone, and all the rest of it? And of course, the city was opened up through Big Bang, and I personally think that has led to something of a deformation in our culture and in our economy, because we have such a very heavily financialized economy. The upside of that is an incredibly successful services industry, but the downside has been, I think, a distortion of capital flows and certainly levels of rent seeking that are not compatible with really effective economic policy. I don't think that manufacturing was disregarded by Mrs. Thatcher at all. I think the trouble was that certain sectors of manufacturing were just highly exposed to global economic change. And as the economy opened up, I think the government possibly underestimated how vulnerable they would be. And of course it did, people forget, it did actually transfer quite a lot of money and investment into those areas. But I think it made a mistake, actually. And I think we've learned from that. We now see that the impact on jobs is absolutely at the centre of economic policy. And that's why, certainly in the last few months, the Chancellor, with the support of myself and other Treasury Ministers, and I felt that particularly because I'm accountable for HMRC, that's why the Chancellor has placed such emphasis on the different COVID policies designed to preserve jobs and support companies, precisely because we understand that the jobs miracle of the last 10 years, in which we've had these extraordinary levels of employment, has been in many ways deeply good for not just the economy, but for human well-being. And we absolutely must not lose that if we possibly can. So that is, I think, the overall picture. I would just add one thing, which is we mustn't forget the things Mrs. Thatcher didn't change. You know, she didn't attempt to privatise the NHS. That's a constant recurrent theme that you hear across politics. She didn't make any effort to do that, and it has, and no effort really has been made since then, although you won't hear that from some of the internet chatter. And that, I think, is also important. So thinking about Thatcher, we're thinking about the legacies and continuities. I think we can be concerned about some areas, we can learn from other areas, but the overwhelming majority of what she left, I think, is something that we should be celebrating.
Jesse, thank you very much for that. And to the audience, we're now going to have a general debate. You're welcome to send questions in, and I will, if you send those questions in, try and get the panelists to answer them as much as possible. There are many different ways in which we could take this, but maybe if I could come off the back of what Jesse was just saying as part of his speech, that there is a need to differentiate between the crisis management aspect of Mrs. Thatcher and the longer-term legacy, because in some respects, Stephen and Vicky, you both question that longer-term legacy. Now, we have had two major crises in the last dozen years, the global financial crisis, which has led to unconventional monetary policy, now this COVID crisis, which in some respects has led to unconventional fiscal policy. But after Thatcher left in 1990, one would argue that the economic and the political debate was very much defined by Thatcher. Tony Blair, in many respects, accepted Thatcherism, not in all its guises, shall we say, but New Labour was part and parcel, reflecting the fact that things had moved on compared to the 70s. Is it your conjecture that we are now seeing a significant turning point, or is it a real challenge for this Conservative government, this Conservative conference even, to sort of try and get things back on what people might say is the straight and narrow if you were a Thatcherite? Stephen and then Vicky.
I think that is sort of both an excellent question and sort of the heart of the kind of thing which causes me to get up in the morning and makes covering politics so exciting at this moment is I don't know. You know, okay. Ernest Bevin said that he wanted to be Minister of Labour from 1945 to 1980, and 1990, and it's because of Margaret Thatcher that he only got to 1980. Right, that was her central achievement. And every government from 1990 on, well, from 1979 all the way to at the very least 2016 was a Thatcherite government in one way or another. Now they contested bits of it, they bolted bits onto it, they tried to soften its edges or sharpen its edges in some instances, but they were all broadly Thatcherite governments. The question is what we're seeing now a rejection of those tenets of Thatcherism? Rhetorically, it unquestionably is. I think then when you have people, I mean, I think Jesse's made a really thoughtful contribution, but I think when people suggest and say the effort to introduce internal markets into the NHS in the 80s, which were then built on by New Labour, were not privatisation, they are slightly, I think, underestimating the extent of the reform that was put in by those governments. And we now have a situation where the government seems to believe that the only problem of the NHS is that it doesn't have enough money. Now that might be true, but that's quite a big departure for a Conservative government, or indeed any government in this kind of Thatcher era to be taking. So I think the big question is this just a rhetorical shift? Is this a real shift but it can't be sustained because, you know, to quote David Cameron, because the facts of life turn out to be Tory and this government is sort of forced, whether through the markets or through failure, to return to the kind of good old Thatcherite methods? Or is this a real change that if the government can't do it, Keir Starmer will? And that is the big question of the next decade.
Okay. Just before I go to Vicky, it is true, though, as Jesse said, that Mrs. Thatcher did state, I think back in 1982, the NHS is safe in our hands, and she did not really attempt to privatise it in one would say, any way, shape or form. There were naturally changes that were implemented, but those changes were changes that were impacting health services in all countries. So, but maybe we can come back to the NHS in a moment. But Vicky, how do you see this in terms of the sort of permanent legacy of Thatcher or the U-turn that is about to behold us? How do you see this issue?
I think it'll be very interesting to see where we are in a few years. We can't say yet because, of course, we've all had to borrow. We're not the only country that has had to borrow. So countries that have been generally sort of run by socialist governments have done the same as right-wing governments have done all across the world. So this has been a crisis which is testing everybody. The question is how long it's going to last and whether we go back to anything that looked like where we were before. But the reality is that certainly the Thatcher legacy, as you said yourself, in terms of controlling PSBR, in other words, the borrowing of the government, which, of course, Margaret Thatcher was always reminding us is really like running a household, which isn't really the right analogy, frankly, but nevertheless, it had been taken quite seriously, and we've seen what happened during the austerity period. You mentioned yourself, Gerald, the crisis we've had, which, of course, the financial crisis is a very important one. We thought we wouldn't see anything like that in our lifetime, but here we are again. When you move to austerity, and then quite a lot of the problems we have now have come from that type of ideology. And also, really, when you look back at some of the main areas that then followed from Margaret Thatcher's own legacy, if you like, although not all of them were done during her period as Prime Minister, such as privatising the railways. There were concerns about the way that was done and it was run, whether it made any sense, even before the COVID crisis. And now, of course, we're looking at changing the system completely, and quite a lot of it is run by, will be run for the government by private firms in the future, probably, but under some different type of regime in terms of what profits you can make out of it. And it's costing the taxpayer an awful lot of money, so we're back to subsidising, which we were already doing, of course, from before. So there are a number of major changes in terms of policy which took place, which are now seen perhaps not to make very much sense, particularly in a globalised environment, particularly in an environment, just think about monetarism again, where you have no capital controls and where money flows and your exchange rate can move up and down very significantly, which means that you don't really have as much control as you like of your own policies. So a rethink is needed. For me, the question is, are we going to revert back to just focusing on controlling one's expenses and revenues and so on in government? Or is one going to have a slightly different attitude in terms of the potential that greater involvement from government has on innovation and productivity and growth more generally, which, you hear a lot of that in some of the intentions on infrastructure spending and so on. But of course, at the same time, as I said, you hear comments saying, we have to get back to controlling our finances. And that's, there's going to be a dilemma, I think, there for a while to come. And I'm not sure right now which of the two is going to win.
Thank you. Maybe for the next few minutes, if we could focus on that sort of economic issue, and within it, the size of the state, because when one thinks back over the 11 years of Thatcher or Thatcherism, while there were many different facets of it, both globally and domestically, often when people talk about Thatcherism, I think they tend to talk about it in economic terms, the deregulation, the supply side agenda. But there was a big difference in some respects between what Mrs. Thatcher said and what she did. In terms of what she said, she didn't take the state on fully. The public spending was still a high proportion. But alongside that, what she did do was really energise the private sector. So in some respects, the rhetoric was very much about the private sector, but the reality was still a very important state role, but not overpowering, and an incentive structure really aimed at energising the private sector. Now, if we were to look now, one of the big challenges facing the country and the Conservative government is the role of the state, the size of the state, and public spending. And obviously with Jesse here from the Treasury, as well as you, Stephen, and Vicky, looking at it from your different perspective, maybe we can focus for the moment on that issue, because for many people, this is a defining characteristic and the defining issue. Is the state too big? if you were really Thatcherite, would you not be trying to shrink the size of the state and energise the private sector? Yesterday, the Chancellor, in his very short speech, in some respects had something in there for everyone. He was highlighting the important role the state can play, but really talking about entrepreneurs and the private sector. In some respects, Thatcherism personified. How would you see it, Jesse, the sort of that whole issue, and maybe where we could see it in Thatcherite terms nowadays? What constraints does it put upon you as a Treasury Minister within the Conservative government looking at this issue?
Well, it's such an interesting question, and of course, I think I suspect everyone around this virtual table would agree that there has to be a budget constraint placed on the state and on public spending, and it may not be one that one wants to impose too early. And of course, I'm not going to talk about whatever plans the Treasury may or may not have now or in the future, but the general principle is that at some point, the size of the state and indeed the size of our debt, as well as our deficit, has to be brought back into some kind of proportion. And it doesn't seem to me that you have to believe any particular kind of economics of a even moderately conventional kind to believe that that's true. So that's the first thing. I mean, you're absolutely right, Gerard, that when Mrs. Thatcher left office, state spending as a percentage of GDP had gone up and down, but it was not, I think, enormously lower when she left than when she arrived. Yeah. But of course, as you also said, that there was a significant change. I mean, the state, I think you can think of it in terms of being extensive or being what you might call pervasive. And I think a lot of what she was trying to do was to remove chunks of the state as it applied to certain aspects of potentially liberatable human energy, but also to try to remove some of the regulation that might have made it too pervasive, too pettifogging, and interfering in people's lives. I do think it's important, though, not to throw the baby out with the bathwater when we look back at this. I mean, there's no doubt that until a few years ago, the railways were creaking even before COVID for a few years. Under the combined pressures of change and customer use. But railway, here I'm going to say something quite, you may find quite controversial, but railway privatisation in many ways was rather successful. For its first decade or two, you saw, of course, it was much impeded by the Hatfield disaster and one or two other things, but very broadly speaking, you saw the number of people taking railways massively expanding, and it was done in a way that allowed capacity to grow, and by continental standards at least, relatively modest subsidies. So I think that's an important thing. If you ask someone today, just to go back to a point Vicky made, what percentage of NHS spending was private, well, they might be surprised to know that the King's Fund last year found that the most recent number was 7.3%. So the idea that the NHS was privatised by Mrs. Thatcher, has been privatised since, is nonsense. And in fact, the most privatising aspect of the NHS, if we're just going to be a little bit detailed about this, was the introduction of PFI by the Blair government, for which they very specifically decided to fire Alistair Ross-Guby, who was the constraint on the PFI panel at the time that would have stopped them from leveraging up their balance sheet. And I think in retrospect, although we might think some hospitals many hospitals are a fantastic thing, and that doesn't mean to say that they weren't procured at enormously expensive costs, which our children and their children will be paying for. So I think we have to think about those aspects of it if we want to get a rounded picture of what was really going on.
Stephen, if we come to the issue of the day in terms of the size of the state, but more particularly the budget deficit, the government, some might say, isn't sure what to do. Ideally, they want to push taxes down. People at the Treasury might be saying you must put taxes up. How do you see this issue unfolding? Do you think they will look, the government, towards Mrs. Thatcher as a sort of the guiding light? Reluctantly, we might have to put one or two taxes up, but overall we don't want to do too much. It's accepting bigger deficits for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, I think because obviously the big constraint here is actually the voters, right? There is a reason why the kind of attempt to balance the books in the way that was embarked on in the first decade of Conservative government had to be abandoned, which was broadly the electorate was just sick of it. And I think then that remains the case. In some ways, the biggest reality of COVID is that we are going to enter a politics where, for all of our political lifetimes, debt is going to be at 100%, more than 100% of GDP. And I think the only politically wearable way to do that for any government will be to deal with that with tax rises rather than with further spending cuts. I kind of think, in some ways, so I guess in that way, actually, the 1981 budget is a pretty good starting point to learn from. But in some ways, it's not Thatcher's legacy that chancellors now have to reckon with. It is the Darling Osborne legacy of those cuts to public spending, and the fact that the electorate just doesn't want any more of those.
Yeah. I would actually say one of the interesting legacies of Thatcherism was the way in which she refuted the economic consensus, the groupthink that dominates too much of economic thinking in this country. The 1981 letter, I was an undergraduate at the time, 1981 letter to the Times signed by 364 economists, she basically ignored. And here at Policy Exchange, I was co-author of a paper arguing that rather than tax increases, we should take advantage of the unique situation of low inflation, low rates and low yields to effectively raise the tax base by stronger economic growth, a go for growth policy. So in some respects, it's, as you say, what the voters want. Now, taking it one step further, a question from Andrew here. Thatcher's property owning democracy will be over if we don't help the next generation own property. Should we tax capital more and income less to achieve that? In some respects, for the voters, there are a number of issues. We can come to jobs in the second, that we're now seeing unemployment go back to levels last seen in the 1980s when Mrs. Thatcher was in power. But for many voters, owning property and actually a tax situation where you knew the direction of travel was for lower taxes would be seen as sort of legacies of Thatcher that many people might actually genuinely want now. Is that how you would see it?
Yeah, I think one of the reasons why our politics has become dysfunctional is that, if I think about, someone in my age group in 1983, they would likely have voted Conservative. They would have been a beneficiary of whether it was Help to Buy or Tell Sid or any of those things. And now that same person mostly can't get on the housing ladder. They are incredibly angry about that, and they were quite likely to vote for Jeremy Corbyn. And I think unless the Conservative Party can fix that basic economic problem, then whether or not it's because the Conservative Party rejects it or the electorate does, then the kind of the Thatcherite dream or model, to the extent that those are still useful terms, can't survive if we're not a property-owning democracy.
Vicky, before I come to Jesse on this issue, Vicky, do you think basically rejuvenating the housing market to increase owner-occupying numbers should be a central tenet of policy for this government?
It all depends what you mean by rejuvenating it. I don't think you can do necessarily through the tax system. We've seen what's happening with the with the stamp duty cuts, where prices are actually going up. So it makes it possibly in the long term more difficult for people to buy a house, particularly if you're not earning very much. Wages are going down right now. So the answer really, even though we have such low interest rates, is to build more houses, and that's what we haven't done. And that hasn't been just the case through Conservative governments, but also the case through Labour governments. And that is the major issue. So it's not the owning, just make more people able to buy.
So taking on the property builders and the way the market is structured at the moment, or would it be the state building more?
I think there's an element of both that needs to be done. There's no doubt about that. The way in which you do tax development, land, and also what you do in terms of encouraging affordable housing to be built, which, as we know, has been lagging behind. So you need more houses, I'm afraid, and I think that's where the problem is. And yes, of course, there have been some moves to ease the planning restrictions that exist to encourage that, but that, of course, brings problems with it anyway. But I think basically sort of building more has to be the answer.
And what about the question about taxing capital more and income less? In a globalised economy, multinationals can move, high-skilled people can move, property doesn't move. Should we be taxing that more and income less, or should we be just grabbing the taxes from wherever we can?
I think one needs to look at capital a lot more, but I think there is another element in terms of when you look at the way in which companies fund themselves. The real problem we've seen right now is that quite a lot of firms in difficulty, particularly large firms, and the ones that are being bought and sold right now, they have huge debts which they have accumulated. And we actually give quite a lot of, and particularly if it's raised here, tax relief on raising debt. I think we should think very hard about changing that and looking at equalising, if you like, so encouraging firms to raise money through equity issues rather than doing it through debt, which I think is going to leave banks and everyone in difficulty for years to come.
Yeah. Jesse, obviously it would be very unfair, given your Treasury position, to ask you any specific questions on this issue. But one nation conservatism has always been an issue at these party conferences. Some people don't see Mrs. Thatcher as part of one nation conservatism, but yet if you look at the characteristics, the numeric numbers that people would measure success in terms of one nation conservatism, owner, occupier, etc., you would say she sort of was top of the list. How do you square all that? Is Thatcher the essence of one nation conservatism, or is she the opposite of that?
Well, I think it's, if you ask Mrs. Thatcher herself whether she was a one nation conservative, I have no doubt whatever that she would have said that she was. And I think she certainly thought she was governing in the interests of the whole nation. And of course, there is a view of Mrs. Thatcher. There was a view at the time, and there is a view in some quarters since then, politically at least, that she was a highly divisive figure. I don't think that was ever something she wanted. There are moments where, she was kind of, I think overturning conventional wisdom and rather delighting in doing that. But I think her attitude over the long term was absolutely one that attempted to lift everyone and to do so across the economy and across the polity.
Do you think, therefore, she would be getting the Chancellor in now and saying, let's squeeze the budget deficit, or would it be because of levelling up, let's let it sort of take more of the strain?
Well, for the reasons you gently highlighted, I'm not going to comment on tax policy or economic policy. Thank you, Gerard, for
the sense of direction. Sorry.
I would say one thing though, which is don't forget the stamp duty cut. I should declare that I'm also responsible for tax policy, but the stamp duty cut was in part designed to stimulate not just that market, but all of the ancillary economic activity that goes with a house purchase and a refurb of a new property, and I think it's been quite successful in that area.
Yeah, I think that's right.
The final point I would make very quickly is we also forget the extent to which Mrs. Thatcher was ahead of her time in ways that we're only beginning to discover now. I mean, we're in the midst of a green revolution. The first world leader to make a speech on the importance of the environment was Mrs. Thatcher, and in doing so, she was running completely contrary to the then conventional wisdom, which really didn't discuss green issues at all. And so when we think about housing, or we think about infrastructure, we think about tax policy, we think about any aspect of government policy now, we're always doing it through a green lens that in part is something we've inherited from her administration.
Thank you. Can I, given the time, touch on the issue of Europe and also the global position of Britain? There's no doubt that when Mrs. Thatcher was Prime Minister, Britain's global standing was seen very high. Regardless of whether you're in the East or the West. There's no doubt that in the last few years, there's been a sort of challenge, shall we say, in terms of the UK communicating its global image. Now, that's tied in maybe to how we position ourselves post-Brexit. But how do you actually see, Stephen, this issue at the moment? Not just what the government does, but if they were looking for sort of guidance from Mrs. Thatcher in terms of both the global positioning of Britain and how we should handle our immediate exit from the European Union?
Well, I think in the global position, in some ways, this is where the kind of historical political achievements of Thatcherism make it almost impossible to answer, right? Her central foreign policy aim and success was helping to win the Cold War. And we're not in a Cold War type situation. We have very serious foreign policy threats, but a kind of the clash of ideologies that define that division, I don't think are as applicable. In terms of the question of Brexit, I mean, we have what looks to be a very, to my eyes, un-Thatcherite exit, right? In the, we essentially, we can see throughout the 1980s there is the Thatcherite European project, the creation of the single market, the economic integration, and then the reimposition of the state at a European level, to badly misquote her. Now we have an exit from the EU in which we have, the one thing that essentially has been ruled out by all parties is that we will be outside of that great Thatcherite achievement of the single market. but we may be seeking to have the freedom to subsidise industry and to pick winners. And it feels to me very much that if you were to look for a Thatcherite inspiration to how to leave the European Union, you would seek to maintain our membership of the single market. You'd be fairly relaxed about immigration from the Central and Eastern European states. I mean, we shouldn't forget EU accession, a Blairite achievement, but also a Thatcherite achievement, because that was a part of the final legacy of winning the Cold War. We wouldn't have, I think, a Brexit very much like the one that it is hinted we are pursuing, in which control over immigration and the ability to pick winners are prioritised over that economic project that we built.
Would it not be a case of maybe she might want to be in the single market, but as long as it did not tie our hands on domestic policy? I'm not saying that's the right approach, but that's surely how people would interpret Mrs. Thatcher. She wouldn't want our hands tied, and if our hands were to be tied, then she would see that sovereignty as the dominant path to take.
I think that is very much a fair description, and one of the difficulties for British statecraft is that while in terms of what Margaret Thatcher's economic aims were, the economic aims of Tony Blair, single market or a Norway-style relationship is very attractive, the deal for Norway is fundamentally a deal struck at a time when the EU was in a confident position globally. The Cold War had just been won, history had ended, and it was for a gift for a political class which wanted to be in the EU but couldn't. It's very difficult to see how you can necessarily, as the first step on a trade deal, get a deal like that when the EU is worried about its own disintegration, its own challenges, and it's a political class which has chosen to leave. But I think that as a model for what the British economy does well, the single market, without having too much of the domestic reach of the ECJ, is the Thatcherite aim, and I think in lots of ways probably, if you want to be outside of the EU and make a success of it, should probably be the United Kingdom's aim.
Okay. In fact, the question's come up from Brian. Maybe Vicky can take that. If an EEC EFTA single market Norway approach is so Thatcherite, why have the left supported it so much? What's your feeling on maybe that question, or more particularly the wider issue, Thatcherite exit from the EU, lessons we should learn?
The answer is I have no idea about the first bit of your question, why they're supporting it, except, of course, on economic grounds, because it does make an awful lot of sense to be as close as we possibly can to the EU. But that's as an economist, because the majority of economists think that anything that you put in terms of friction to trade increases costs and therefore is bad for the economy, particularly given that we sell 45% of our goods to them. On the Thatcherite issue and Europe, I think it is really quite interesting because if I have interpreted what was going on during the Thatcher era properly, and I mentioned before that Jesse didn't quite agree, but there was a lot of emphasis on services which were growing and which have now become very important. What I find quite strange in the current negotiations is that we're focusing so much on, yes, okay, fish perhaps matters, and perhaps tariffs on goods up to a point on state aid, which of course, again, is interesting enough, on mainly would be applicable in manufacturing area, but there is little emphasis on services. And as Stephen was saying, there's the question of free movement of people, but also we have really not done enough for the financial sector, which we thought was quite an important part of our economy. There's huge issues still in terms of how our banks can operate and other financial institutions in the future, and that is quite significant. Yes, of course, it matters for Europe too, but it matters hugely for the UK, and that seems to be running in parallel, but with not huge amount of progress so far. And one wonders, because if you have non-tariff restrictions that are there for your services, then that can be a very, very serious problem for the economy when you look ahead. And I would imagine that Thatcher wouldn't quite like that.
Jesse, I'm not sure if you wanted to comment on that, but in some respects it comes back to some of the points you were addressing about the need to differentiate between the crisis management and long-term vision that came out with Mrs. Thatcher. There is a perception, rightly or wrongly at the moment, that the government needs greater clarity about its vision, and that's a global view as well. Do you think the UK needs to be working more on its global image at the moment, or is this something that will naturally follow as we emerge from this crisis?
Well, I think we're in a period of transition, and as Stephen pointed out, the kind of the very, very sharp edges of the Cold War no longer exist. We we live in a multilateral, as people sometimes say, plurilateral world. And I personally think there's a fantastic future for Britain in that area. And, and that is a vision in which we can be a trusted global source of standards and culture and law. And I think that is available to us over the next 15 or 20 years. And we need to continue to invest in that. And if you see it, whether it's a matter of literature or language or law or many other aspects, finance, Britain is absolutely globally world leading. So I think that future potentially exists for us. Of course, we need to get over current economic hurdles and political hurdles of COVID and of Brexit. But we will do that, and in due course we'll be able to focus on that. I'd say one other thing though, which is I don't think I personally, I mean, we can do a lot of, if Mrs. Thatcher were only here, what would she say? But I think I suspect she would have been deeply worried about, and in fact we know she was deeply worried towards the end of her life about the movement from an economic activity which she had supported very much through the single market and Lord Cockfield to a political entity. And I think the EU took a very decisive move away from that Europe des patries Gaullist vision. And when it decided, first of all, on monetary union, and then ultimately on other aspects of ever closer union. And so in some respects, I think the jeux sont faits, as they say, the dice have been cast. But that doesn't mean to say that we can't have a very effective and successful future relationship with the EU. And I do think in issue of state aid, I mean, as you said, you can read it purely economically, and many people are insisting on doing that for political reasons. But you can also read it as a matter of sovereignty, that a government should be able to set its own rules, even if in fact it chooses to allow no state aid at all. And the irony, of course, of this is that we've been one of the least state aid exploiting and most compliant countries in Europe, even while we are sticking up for our own need as a sovereign entity to be able to set levels at levels we choose.
Thank you. Now, I'm going to ask people to make their final comments of closing statements, but one question has just come in. Maybe, Jesse, you want to take this very quickly. From Oliver, is social conservatism an important part of Thatcherism? And would the war on the woke be a Thatcherite winning policy?
Well, I think it's one of the joys about Mrs. Thatcher is the more you read into her life, the more you realise how free from the conventional wisdom she was in many different ways. And she might not have taken the caricature position on wokeness, whatever that is, that people might think. No, I think Mrs. Thatcher was someone who was intensely concerned about matters of personal justice as well as of national justice. And if she felt that people were being mistreated or were being, in some sense, the victim of social majority ganging up, whatever part of the political spectrum or cultural spectrum they would have come from, I suspect she would have come sailing in with her handbag to protect the underdog, and rightly so.
Very good. Closing comments, but maybe I can pose a question in terms of your closing comments, Stephen. It seems to me that the way you see it, correct me if I'm wrong, is that the Labour leadership can now suddenly, post-Corbyn, post the last 4 decades, sort of cast off the sort of constraint of feeling they need to be close to Blair, close to Thatcher, and we might have a more competitive political environment ahead. So what would be your key takeaway? Your view is Thatcherism over? The answer would be yes, it seems to me. But if it is over, what's going to lie ahead in the next year?
Well, this is the big question, because we are leaving the regulatory fetters that are co-designed by Thatcher and her inheritors. That frees up on both the left and the right the ability to build a new political economy, and in some ways, because of the disruption involved in that change, it compels people to come up with a new political economy, because some of the things we did very well in the EU, we simply won't be able to do as well outside of it, and other things we will be able to do very differently. Is Thatcherism over? Yeah, I think what I would say is I think it's not in a state of great health. I think one of the problems is that I think that, this party needs to work out what its actual feelings about the economic decisions taken over the last 40 years were. Because if the kind of concern about the plight of the seats it won for the first time in 2019 is sincere, that has big implications for whether or not those were the right decisions. But equally, if the party feels, as people will be able to hear around this conference, feels, as eloquently and sincerely about the massive changes in the conditions of the global poor that have been built over the last 40 years, that gets them to a different political and economic position. And I think the big question is actually how much does the Conservative Party really believe in its 2019 position, and how much does the Conservative Party feel its 2019 position was about escaping from the parliamentary deadlock, the need to get Brexit done. And I think actually it will be the decision the Conservative Party reaches about its own ideological future that will define the next decade.
But if Mrs. Thatcher was in power, people would immediately turn to the leader. Do you think the answer to that question you've posed has to be answered by the leader himself, or is it by the party?
I think leaders ultimately decide, but I think in this specific case it will primarily be a decision which comes from below rather than from above.
Okay, thank you for joining us. Vicky, is Thatcherism over? As an economist, maybe I could use the analogy of a barbell in the gym. A barbell has weights at one end and weights at another end. And the UK is a very imbalanced economy. The weights at one end, we're world leaders in some areas. Services, you touched on, financial services. At the other end, we're a low-wage, low-productive economy. It seems that the successful parts of the economy are attributed by the Conservatives to Thatcherism, and it seems that the left attribute all the underperforming, the bars at the other end of the economy, to Thatcherism as well, which highlights the sort of reason why I see such a, to use the words of others, a Marmite character. But there's no doubt that in economic terms, 1979, like 45, maybe like 1931, were pivotal economic moments. Stephen touched on, we might want to readdress that. But your closing comment on Thatcherism with your economic hat on, you touched on this in some respects, but your key takeaway given that?
Well, there is a problem that productivity has suffered very significantly, and right now it's suffering again. We're just seeing through the actual crisis that this has been a serious problem because, of course, hours have been reduced and quite considerably. Output has fallen even more, so productivity has suffered. So the question is, can we really recover? My real worry about this whole period of implementing tight fiscal policies is that investment has lagged behind. The private sector investment that we wanted to see happen has not really been giving enough boost to the economy. So we have fallen into a low growth environment even before the crisis hit. And it's worth remembering that the last forecast of the Bank of England in January of 2020, just before we realized the extent of the COVID crisis, were for growth of just 0.8% this year. And it was going to be followed by growth of just between 1.2 and 1.5% for the years that followed to the end of the Parliament. That was not a very good underlying growth to allow for a rise in revenues and for perhaps the public sector to do well financially. And of course, we expected at the time that there would be quite a tight restriction on spending. So here we are now with a much more great willingness to spend and borrow. But I'm suspecting that we are going to see a return to worrying more about PSBR and basically sort of deficits and borrowing in the next few years than perhaps, and hope that growth will recover, but perhaps less about anything else. And the expectation for me is that we are going to see taxes go up. Remember, even during the austerity period, actually, although there were spending cuts, there were also a lot of increases in stealth taxes. There have already been some hints that the tax regime will change, whether it's fuel duty or whether it's, we just talked about capital gains tax earlier. So I'm suspecting we are going to be going back to worrying a lot more about whether the borrowing is sustainable or not. And this is a brief period, I think, during which we can enjoy Keynesian economics, if you like, actually having hopefully an impact on the economy alongside loads and loads of other countries. And we will perhaps revert back. But the big question mark as to which of the bits, which part of it, as you mentioned before, has the greatest pull.
Lots of issues there. We will continue another time, maybe, Vicky. But Jesse, over to you. The final word, is Thatcherism over? and really what's next.
Thank you very much, and thanks everyone again for a great talk. So I would say this, that of course in a crisis we're all Keynesians, but that doesn't mean that Keynesianism has somehow overtaken the political agenda more widely, and we need to go back to the original distinction I made about, as it were, long-term government versus crisis management. I think if you'd asked someone in 2010, would they, coming out of that financial crisis, have settled for 10 years plus an OBR forecast for further 3 or 4 years of unbroken economic growth, they would have bitten your arm off. And yes, it's true that the economic growth isn't as high as we would like, and it's certainly true that we have an embedded productivity problem in the UK of a kind that you hinted at when you were setting up this final conversation, Gerard. So you're right about that. And it's also true, and here in a way is a Thatcherite point on which I think we can all agree, and I would certainly pick up and agree with Vicky's final comment in this area. Private investment is going to be absolutely essential. We've historically seen in this country, in the US, these enormous corporate cash balances, and they have not been liberated even by ultra low interest rates. We need to find some mechanism for encouraging that business investment to recover. And certainly on the infrastructure side, we're planning to spend 600 billion odd pounds in infrastructure. Only half of that, I mean, that's a lot of money, but half of that comes from the public sector. Half of it's coming from the private sector. So we have to have, and we'll be publishing later this year, a national infrastructure strategy designed to talk about this, but we will have to have very significant private investment across the country. And that, I hope, will be part of a levelling up agenda of the kind that we've described, and that will bring the country together and start to remedy some of those deep-seated concerns that predated even Mrs. Thatcher in 1979.
Thank you. So we're all Keynesians in the crisis, but private investment is key in the recovery, is the takeaway I took there. Look, thank you to everyone for joining us, either live or after the event. Thank you to Stephen Bush, thank you to Vicky Pryce, and thank you to the Right Honourable Jessie Norman, and thank you to Policy Exchange for hosting this event. Thank you, goodbye.